Alright guys, welcome back to part 3 of my high intensity philosophy adaptation. First video we kind of broke down how human science is kind of sort of mostly theoretical. There are some laws like, Wolff's Law, which has a lot to do with how bones adapt. Henneman's size principle, which is mostly what bodybuilding is based entirely off of. The all or nothing law, which has a lot to do with muscle fibers too. There are some things that are law in human sciences. However, for the most part, it's largely theoretical. We went over not just that, but also the difference between sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and myofibrillar hypertrophy. Then that led into why I think trying to quantify intensity through sets and reps, how a lot of this actually holds us back and sets us up for failure, and how I think the only metric that's possible to even quantify intensity is time. Which leads into video number 3, which is why I believe that pulling the lever of time, using time as a form of measurement, ultimately allows you to do things like forced negatives and rest pause after concentric failure to increase the amount of time by which you are spending under maximum load. So let's get right into it. I'm going to go through some clips from Arthur Jones and Mike Menser and some of Evan Dorian Yates.
Let's start in the beginning with the first rep. Of all the reps of the set, the first rep obviously would be the easiest, requiring the least intensity of effort. Or, referring to the definition of intensity that you've written down, one would say that the first rep requires the least percentage of his possible momentary muscular effort of all the reps of the set. Allow me to explain this point a little further, then we'll move more briskly straight ahead, I promise. If you were to look outside right now and happen to see a loved one pinned under the front wheel of a car, we've all heard stories like this, you would dart out there as quickly as you possibly could, and in the attempt to remove the automobile, you would exert yourself with 100% of your possible momentary muscular effort. Or to make it more simple from here on, let's just plug in the word for the definition. You would exert yourself with 100% intensity of effort. Now, the first rep of that set of curls would not require anywhere near 100% intensity of effort. Again, it would be the easiest rep of the set. That first rep does fatigue you somewhat, however, and that is why the second rep is at least a little bit harder to complete. Whereas, the first rep may require on the order of 8 to 10% intensity of effort. The second rep, you see, may require closer to 15 to 20% intensity of effort. And without belaboring the issue, you know that's how it goes with each successive rep of the set. Each becomes progressively harder to complete. Each requires more intensity of effort than did the preceding, until finally, we get to the last rep, in this case, the 10th rep to failure. That would be the only rep which is said to require 100% intensity of effort, just like trying to lift the automobile.
Alright, so in terms of intensity of effort being applied and how it begins as easy and then gets harder as it gets towards the last rep, he's ultimately explaining Henneman's size principle just in simple layman's terms. Now, this is where I disagree with Mike. I don't entirely believe that once we reach concentric failure, that we are anywhere near 100% intensity of effort. Now, the reason I believe this is because muscles are actually stronger in the isometric and the negative hold. Really, concentric failure is ultimately the inability to move the weight. Not resist the weight, because it says resistance training, but to move the weight beyond a specific sticking point. But anyways, when it comes to Henneman's size principle, right, the first rep is significantly easier because you still have lower threshold fibers, the lazy fibers, or the less capable fibers that are participating and helping the higher threshold fibers exert force. Just to give you a simple analogy, let's say you're a parent and you have the goal of picking up sticks and then later using a chainsaw to cut up a fallen tree. At the beginning, in the picking up of sticks phase, you have your children, which are exemplary of the lower threshold fibers, who are helping you walk around and pick up sticks, because that's a low threshold job that doesn't require much force. But the moment you get to having to cut up the fallen tree and move bigger logs around, you tell the children to back off. This is more dangerous work. Let daddy do this. And when you are reaching concentric failure, you are ultimately reaching the point of the task where the sticks have been picked up and you're now walking over to the log with the chainsaw to begin chopping it up. That is ultimately what intensity is the lower threshold fibers giving out because they can no longer participate. They're like the children, and the higher threshold fibers are like the adults, and the adults are just stronger than the children. And I believe ultimately that what intensity actually boils down to, and this is where Mike gets it wrong, when you try to focus it in terms of reps, you ultimately deduce it down to concentric, the ability to contract. And this was something he later corrected after he retired. He started to change his tune a little bit on these things because he started to teach negatives and rest pause. And that's when he started theorizing against the contraction entirely and the lifting of weights.
Come to discover that lifting weights is a waste of time. In fact, dear listener, you would do much better to start holding the weights in the contracted position, only doing the lowering of the weight. Let me give you the rationale. The positive portion of any exercise, the lifting of the weight, is the least productive in terms of stimulating an increase. Why? Because it's the weakest part of the movement. You cannot lift nearly as much weight as you can hold, and you can't hold as much weight as you can lower.
And if you can't do any positive or full range dips, then place a chair or bench between the dip bars, stand up into the straight arm, locked elbow position, and lower yourself in negative fashion. When you can perform up to 10 negative dips, with each rep taking several seconds to complete, you should be able to do regular full range dips.
This is a rep pause set, which means he does single rep maximum attempts, followed by a 5 to 7 second pause.
But anyways, it moves into why I like to do negatives and rest pause to push myself. Buffer Jones.
You can do chins, for example. Stand on a chair to get into the top position and then lower yourself down. Most women can't chin themselves. Most women can do a negative chin by simply climbing up onto a chair or a footstool into the top position and taking their feet off of the stool or the chair and slowly lowering themselves down. By training in that fashion, within a few weeks they will increase their strength so much that they can do chins in a normal fashion. And a few other exercises like that. But where possible, don't try to avoid the negative part of work. In fact, emphasize the negative part of work. Accentuate the negative part. Because the negative part of exercise is by far the most important part of exercise.
Here he is again in the third clip, actually talking about a very specific instance in which this experiment was performed.
Man weighed 286 pounds, and one of his tests was he had to chin himself a certain number of times. Do a pull-up on a bar. This man couldn't begin to chin himself. Well, we take him to a chinning bar, he reaches up, he grabs a hold of the bar, he tries to pull, and nothing happens. So what do? Well, you can't train him in a positive manner. He's incapable of pulling himself up. So we put him on a bench in the top position, and then we removed the bench and told him to lower himself. The first time we did it, he went zap to the floor. He just about yanked his arms out by the roots. He couldn't even do a negative chin. He couldn't lower himself. So we held him up. We stood under him, held him by the buttocks, and gave him assistance so that he could do part of the negative work. 12 days later, he was tested. He did 4 3/4 chins in a normal fashion, pulling himself up and lowering himself down, pulling himself back up. He didn't quite get 5, but that was more than enough to pass his test. Those kind of results can be produced with negative exercise. They cannot be produced in any other fashion. The negative part of work, Steve, is by far the most productive and the most important part of exercise. And when you leave the negative work out of exercise, you have little or nothing of benefit left.
Yeah, I mean, so look, guys, people treat concentric failure as if that is actual failure of the muscle's ability to even be able to perform the task that you demand of it. And that's not true. That's not actually the case. And by looking at concentric failure as if that is 100% failure, is actually leaving a ton on the table. When you reach concentric failure, you're more than likely, just to put a number to it, maybe failing at like 60%. You still have 40% to be able to spend time under that near maximal load. And he kind of proves it here. So if the negative and the ability to isometrically hold is stronger, and again, there's a lot of intramuscular science that goes into why that's possible, like, sarcomere lengthening and cross-sectioning between there's a lot that goes into it, but it is true that we are stronger in these movements. And if we are stronger in these movements, if our muscles are capable of withstanding more tension while requiring less force to do so, what you ultimately get is the ability to extend the amount of time that you are actually under maximal tension. Let's keep it moving. This is something Mike Menser said to Dorian at one point.
Dorian about this the other day. We've been staying in closer contact. I got him real psyched up. Oh, did you? I said, look, Dorian, there has never been a single bodybuilder, including myself, that has ever reached the absolute upper limit dictated by his genetic potential. Why can I say that with absolute certainty? Because in order to do so, you literally have to train fucking perfectly.
You have to train perfectly. And here's the thing, of course, during this time, Mike Menser and Arthur Jones were still theory crafting what they thought perfect training might look like based on the scientific principles that had been founded about human physiology. And since then, I mean, not much about that has really changed. So really still to this day, we're theory crafting the best possible way to reach our genetic potential. And truthfully, I think this idea of having a genetic ceiling is overplayed. I think people talk about it way too much because most people aren't truly going to see it. Most people who train their whole entire life, they really care about this. They started at a young age. And even if you take me, for example, right? I think my journey started with me caring about having a six-pack. And I must have been maybe 11 years old and started doing sit-ups every single day. And then eventually I got like a really cheap bench, like the 1-inch bars, right? The 1-inch bars with the stupid metal spinners as catches. God, I hate those weights. But then I started benching. I think that happened when I was like 14. It's like I've been doing this my whole entire life and have only in recent years started truly blowing up in size. Kind of sort of how I talked about in previous videos, how guys will spend their whole entire life just barely incrementally growing and adding to their structure, only to finally start blowing up in size when they discover high-intensity training. And Mike Menser was exactly the same way. Dorian Yates was exactly the same way. All of these guys discover this stuff way too late in the game to ever truly discover their genetic potential. And I think if you look at this mathematically, our ability to ultimately put on muscle is in fact limited to the elasticity of our joints and how healthy things are, which is oftentimes linked to our age. So, in our ability to recover, right? Our hormonal profile, even, you know, from the moment we start puberty, we essentially have a built-in steroid system, steroid levels of testosterone. And if you take advantage of that and the high intensity philosophy from that early of an age, then, maybe then, if the high intensity philosophy is consistently practiced from the age of, say, 14 until 35, then you might see a human who finally is reaching the upper limits of the potential before the decline in testosterone and joint health and all these things start to stop being in a window of optimal and starts declining. If you do this form of training from an earlier age, and I think that also plays into why most people think that the genetic ceiling is important, and I think it's ultimately because people aren't training properly. I think what happens is people plateau early on, and they think that plateaus are genetic limitations, and to a degree that is kind of sort of true, but it is a genetic limitation that you are forcing yourself to meet because you are not pushing yourself intensely enough. The body is only going to adapt in accordance to the intensity that you are demanding of it. So if your approach to training is 1 to 2 reps in reserve and chasing volume because you're reducing the intensity, there is some intensity there. There's just no way to possibly measure how close that is to failure. I know it's not close enough to true muscular failure, but there is some degree of intensity there, and there will likewise be some adaptation. But if that's all you ever do, you're not pushing the thresholds of you know, higher threshold fibers recruiting under duration, then yeah, you're going to reach a plateau. You're going to stall out, and gains are going to be very, 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 very minimal from then onward. And people look at that, they experience that, and that happens to them, and they think, oh, well, you know, it's just not within my genetics to be one of these crazy freak monsters. And truthfully, a lot of these crazy freak monsters, like Arnold, even Mike Mentzer has said himself that this high volume philosophy doesn't even work for everyone if they're taking copious amounts of drugs. That there's very, very, very few people who will respond to that type of training. And even then, he believed that it was inefficient, and that those people would also be even bigger and freakier if they did high intensity training. For whatever genetic reason, some people might respond to sarcoplasmic hypertrophy better than others. Just because your body might respond better to that doesn't mean that leaving behind the high intensity training, the myofibular hypertrophy, is optimal or to your advantage. Arnold would have probably been significantly bigger and freakier had he adapted Mike's philosophy and listened to Mike Mentzer. But anyways, this was also Dorian Yates commenting on something Mike Mentzer has said, and I've heard him say it. I just couldn't find the clip before I got started here, but I really like this analogy because this is very much how intensity does tend to work, and how reps in reserve and chasing volume, how the body kind of tends to treat that.
Came across Mike Mentzer, who was a Mr. Universe and controversially didn't win the Mr. Olympia in 1980. I was very impressed with the writing about high-intensity training and the logic, and it's the first guy to really ask a lot of questions and get the answers. So let's say you could do 8 reps, you could do 10 reps with a certain weight, but you stop at 7 or 8. You don't go to 10 or 11. It's not enough intensity. Oh yeah, but I do more volume. It's not enough intensity. Mentzer used to use an analogy which I like. It's like if you have a stick of dynamite and you hit it with a pencil, it doesn't go off. The impact is not enough. If you tap it the second time and the third time and the 100th time, will it go off? No. But you hit it one time with a hammer, boom, message sent. So I'm Mr. Olympia, the best bodybuilder in the world, and I didn't spend more than 4 hours a week lifting weights.
Come on, I spent more in the gym lifting
Yeah,
weights.
but you didn't train with me. After half an hour, you want to go home.
Dude, it's funny, like, even the interviewer's like, man, you spend less time in the gym than me. Yeah, and look at you. It's my point. It's what I mean. Not chasing effort and intensity and time under maximal load, maximal tension is a waste of time. And I love the analogy of it's like just tapping a stick of dynamite with a pencil. Each set that you perform where you are not seeing how long you can force the muscle to endure output under intense demand. If you aren't doing that and you're just like leaving reps in reserve and doing all this stupid shit, each one of those sets is like tapping a pencil to a stick of dynamite. That's not enough force to cause the dynamite to go off. You need more intensity to force an adaptation to the muscle. And again, this goes back to why I think most people have never reached their genetic potential. Because again, even Dorian here talks about going only to the 10th or 11th rep. He's still looking at things when it comes to concentric failure. Most people look at concentric failure as being the metric by which intensity is measured. And I that's wrong. I think that's wrong. The muscles have far more capacity to continue after concentric failure, because concentric failure isn't actual failure of the muscle's capacity to produce more force. To make it as simple as possible, concentric failure is the muscle's inability to produce force to move the weight beyond a specific sticking point. That's all concentric failure is. It's not the inability for a muscle fiber to continue producing force. It is the muscle fiber's inability to produce enough force to move a weight beyond a specific sticking point. Completely and entirely different things, people. If you're using concentric failure as a metric for true failure, true muscular failure, you are not coming even close, right? And I'll even put it up on the screen that when you look at how long, because now that I did this last workout video, I'm recording the timer of first how long it takes for me to reach concentric failure to then begin my post-concentric work towards true muscular failure, where I cannot hold it or even negatively control it anymore. That is what muscular failure looks like. It's not concentric. Muscular failure happens in the isometric and negative control. It's almost like it sends a larger signal of demand for the muscle to adapt. It's hard to explain, but the more I train, seeking how to what depth I can push intensity, I can push my muscles to endure maximal time under maximal tension. That's when I have grown the most. So that is ultimately why I do things the way I am doing them, guys. That's why I'm kind of skipping the idea of doing reps, and now, as you see, I'm starting to just do the isometric holds. I'm completely bypassing the weakest, the most mechanically disadvantageous portion of joint movement. Let's just make it really simple and do a bicep curl. And let's say you got it down here at your waist, and let's say you go and you can't get it up past this point, and you think you're done, and it's like, no, look, this having to move the joint and the moment arm from a completely stretched position to the middle range of motion to this point where the load is now maximal, because the weight is incredibly far away from your body. Torque has now increased because of the fact that it's incredibly far away from your body. all these different profiles change in our mind what we think we're capable of. Whereas if you just, get up here into a chin up and hold it, you're not having to worry about any of those things. Literally, at that point, your only focus is seeing how long you can hold on. Muscles are stronger in the negative. There isn't really debating that. Even science will tell you, I can pull it up, that muscles actually are capable of generating 20 to 40% more force in the isometric and negative phases of a contraction. Yeah, eccentric contractions allow muscles to generate 20 to 40% more force than concentric contractions. This strength advantage is due to greater mechanical tension and lower energy costs during muscle lengthening under load. Research consistently shows that eccentric strength is approximately 40% greater than concentric strength on average, with some studies reporting ratios as high as 1.62 in older adults. As you can see here, guys, I'm not bullshitting you. Like, we are significantly stronger in our ability to hold a contraction and then control it into the negative. So, like, why is eccentric strength 40% stronger? Cross-bridge mechanics. During eccentric contractions, actin and myosin filaments are pulled apart while still bound, requiring more force to break the cross bridges than is generated during concentric shortening. This allows the muscles to resist higher loads. So there's that elastic contribution. So this creates passive tension in the muscles, which helps resist their lengthening. Truthfully, you don't have to understand the sciences as to why. Just understand the concept that it is in fact true that the muscles are stronger when you are holding a contraction and actively resisting the pulling apart of muscle, of the actin and the myosin within the muscle. So, concentric failure is not a good indicator of actual muscular failure. If you have failed concentrically, understand that is when you truly begin to start counting. It is at that point when you have failed to contract further. You are now in a place where you are recruiting maximal muscle fibers. You are recruiting the higher threshold fibers. And now it is a game of how long you can stay under tension to keep the recruitment of those fibers activated in one single go. And to give you an example of why this is important, let's just think of this logically. Let's say you take two identical twins. Let's say they understand they need to push beyond concentric failure. But let's say one identical twin concentrically fails, gets himself into a position where he can perform one more controlled negative rep, and then he stops. But his identical twin brother, who performed the same movement, said, I'm not stopping at one. I'm going to see how long I can keep myself exposed to near maximal recruitment of these higher threshold fibers before my regulatory systems, like my ability to breathe, will no longer allow me to do this. I believe that even if, let's just say hypothetically that both is enough, because I think it is. I think in this hypothetical, both stimulus is enough for both of them to grow. I am making the argument here that the twin who exposes himself to a longer duration near that maximal tension in that one single set is creating for himself a greater degree of adaptation, given that he gives himself enough time to recover and then overcompensate, which we will get into in part 4. Part 4 is going to be all about recovery, because I think everyone focuses, and the massive amount of this philosophy is, yes, focused on intensity, high intensity training. It's literally in the name. It's focused on seeing how much you can push the intensity of your exercise. And that much is true. There's no taking away from that. However, most people suffer from seeing how many times they can do with them. Always seeing how much they can get done with little rest. And we'll get into why I believe that is ultimately wrong. How intensity is only half of the equation, and how ultimately the other half of the equation is recovering from that intensity. Come back next time for that. Thanks for stopping by. See you next time.